St. Mary's City, Maryland is the site of the fourth successful British colony in North America. First settled in 1634, it is quick to become recognized as the second of Britain's tobacco colonies, after Virginia. Tobacco was a way of life for the colonists in the Chesapeake region. For the vast majority of those settled here, planting, growing, and cultivating of tobacco consumed the majority of their days. We know a tremendous amount about the practices of those producing tobacco, as well as the transatlantic economy that grew around this crop. But one area that is at the moment poorly understood is in the practices of merchants and sailors who came from England to export thousands of hogsheads of tobacco annually to England and the European markets. The St. Mary's River Archaeological Project is centered around one site in particular in the St. Mary's River. It is known currently as a ballast distribution, an ovular shape about 50 feet in length by 20 feet in width. And in association with it in the past have been found Dutch red sugar bricks and large bore pipe stems, white clay pipe stems, which indicate a 17th century date if they are in fact associated. The stones themselves have been described as likely European in origin, and this gives every indication that this site is the remains of a 17th century trade vessel, most likely English. This fieldwork is part of a larger project that's aimed at better understanding of tobacco trade throughout the 17th century with Britain. We currently know quite a bit about tobacco trade, or the land-based matters of it, but the maritime aspects are quite understudied. So we're hoping to learn such things as which routes they were taking at which times, because trade routes were changing throughout the 17th century, as well as how trade functioned throughout that time, looking for the push towards the centralization of the tobacco trade. And to do so, I've been studying various 17th century documents, some of which are passenger narratives and ship's logbooks. The first passenger narrative I'd like to mention is the 1634 account of Father Andrew White on his voyage to Maryland on the Ark and the Dove. These were the first two ships to head to Maryland with settlers, and he describes a southern route heading south from England by the coast of Spain and northwest Africa before venturing westward to Barbados, stopping off at several Caribbean islands, and then heading north along the eastern seaboard of the U.S. And the second source is a logbook of one sailor called Edward Rhodes. These date from 1670 to 76, where he describes a total of 12 voyages, 6 round trip, from London to the Chesapeake on tobacco trading vessels. 4 different ships are mentioned, and he does talk directly about St. Mary's City in one of the voyages, which has been very informative because that's telling us a bit more about how trade functioned in the 17th century. It's been speculated in the past that ships would pull up to the wharves and landings of each individual plantation. Currently, for the area, we have zero evidence of any wooden structures in the river or rivers in the area during that period. But ships could have pulled up to each plantation, but from this we're seeing that the ships were anchoring in the middle of the river and sending their own tending vessels ashore to collect the tobacco from each plantation. So you can imagine a large ship is quite cumbersome, and maneuvering it around a river and pulling it into each landing would be quite difficult. So it's been good that we've learned about these aspects, but we still have much more to learn, so we'll be looking at more more of these historical documents, including port records and insurance claims, and try to have a better understanding of what these ships looked like, how they functioned, how many people were needed to sail them, what a typical crew would look like, and the aspects mentioned before, trade functions and shipping routes. So we'll see what we're able to learn from this season of fieldwork, and hopefully it will lend to a second season.
Prior to the examination of the logbooks, we could only speculate on the trade routes taken in the 17th century by vessels heading to the Chesapeake region. This map from Middleton's volume on maritime activities in the colonial Chesapeake shows the presumed routes on both the southern and northern passages. The northern passages are likely based on later 18th century documents. Winds and currents were better understood during this time, and ships were able to sail rather smoothly in this northward arc from England to the eastern seaboard of North America. When plotting the route of the Ark and the Dove, we see that it falls in line roughly with the route described by Middleton. But with the later Edward Rhodes voyages, we can see that this is a period of transition between the two logical routes of the early 17th century and the northern passage of the 18th century. The route shown takes the ships directly against prevailing winds, which seems to push them south into the mid-ocean gyration known as the Sargasso Sea. Sailing out of season, that is, leaving after October, seems to affect this passage in a very significant way and create a much more difficult and perilous voyage. For the return route, we can see a relatively simple crossing, following prevailing winds and currents. Rhodes's best crossings took him 39 days from England to the Chesapeake and 29 days on the return. Plotting these voyages has shown perhaps the best and nearly the worst of what one could expect crossing the Atlantic during the 17th century. And now we can say with a degree of certainty that finding the northern route across the Atlantic was a long process, and not simply a smooth transition.
What we're hoping to accomplish this year is to create a good, accurate site map off of which we can work next year, as well as perform an assessment of the archaeology that's there and what we can potentially learn from it. We'll be carrying out a survey using scuba equipment and various measuring tools, and surface collecting some of the artifacts, hoping especially for some of the ballast to be currently exposed so that we can gather these for analysis. And we'll base our work for next season off of what we find this year.